Hello once again. I'm Greg Lowen, and this is the final chapter and the epilogue of my folktale arc, Raven Today. We just saw how Raven in chapter 5 encountered and confronted the great city of the newcomers, where many of his own children had been lost in the dark recesses of this urban netherworld. And as Raven leaves this city, he encounters something else of great interest that eventually leads him to the climax and ultimate solution of the wider mystery that he has confronted in the modern world. So this is chapter 6, Raven and the Museum. Yet before Raven had even left the great city behind, after visiting with his lost children once again, he had been distracted by the sight of a cluster of tall totem poles. What village is this? He wondered to himself. How could there be such a place within the midst of the newcomers' overwhelming habitation? Settling down on top of the tallest of the poles, Raven saw that the likenesses of both himself and many of his friends and comrades were present, as well as those of the people. He scanned down the crests and visages, reading them off one by one. Some of the poles spoke slightly differently than those he had been used to, but some were the same. Even so, even though these poles could still speak, there was no one in the village, no one at all. Raven cocked his head at the place. Indeed, the people must be inside their longhouses, for there were 3 of these, well built and perfectly preserved. What was this place? Raven had never known there to be a village of any kind in this specific spot, and aside from the 3 houses, the dozen or so poles, another odd thing that, Raven thought, so few houses and poles alike, there was a very large building off to the south, skirted by gravel, with massive clear panels for walls. It was not a long house at all, as the rest of it was constructed from the same grayish material that most of the newcomers' city sported. And now, peering into it through the transparent walls, Raven saw that there were yet more poles inside the structure. Now this is strange, he murmured. Tall poles that would only be outside in a normal village were standing erect, some of them in sections, inside this giant house. And the more Raven peered into it, the more he realized that the poles on the inside were a few of those he had seen outside in other places, far from this spot. How could they have been transported here, and why? Who would have done this, and how long had they been here, away from their places of origins? A chill ruffled Raven's feathers just then, as he realized a startling thing. These poles were the kin of the lost souls and lost poles. And yet this was also not quite right, for these ancient poles from up and down the entirety of the coast and its islands had been preserved in a beautiful place, one that must have cost a great amount of time and effort to construct. But were they too not prisoners, even so? Though he had planned to fly back to the big island to ask the guardian if any of the lost souls had found their way back to her now that Wolf and his kin were working for them, he realized he needed to make a much more serious investigation into this novel phenomena. New poles outside in a village with no one in it, old poles inside of a great house where there were people wandering about. It made no sense on the face of it. Flying over to the transparent wall, Raven thought he would be able to simply go right through it, but this proved to be an error. As he had seen on the countless giant pillars of the newcomer cities, the material was something one could see through but not pass through. Very clever, but also very annoying. Try as he might, Raven could find no aperture by which to effect ingress. The people inside paid him no attention whatsoever, and the poles, at least the ones that hadn't been cut up, were mute, and he could not discern any of their voices. He did recognize quite a few of them, though, and recalled exactly where they had been originally raised. Tanu, Ninstance, Gans, and Lumsden, to name a few. This too made no sense. These were very different villages, far apart, inhabited by people who didn't always get along all that well. How could such different poles, speaking different tongues, have all congregated together in one place? It was no surprise, at least now that Raven had been able to see which poles were in there, that they refused to speak to one another and to the people wandering amongst them, craning their necks up and up. Raven found himself doing the same. Here were the 3 watchmen, with dried-up moss and grass for hair, and there was Eagle, his beak looking a little droopy, and now Bear, holding a large salmon, staring with empty sockets across the odd hall, and he himself, many likenesses of him, in fact. He recalled the very carvers of some of them, souls he had known and inspired, and who in turn honored him and made him feel like he was part of the place and in the hearts of the people. Well, at the very least, Raven mused, this place had saved all of these old poles from falling into inevitable decay. Many had come from villages that had been abandoned some short generations after the Great Death. He had seen their sites, twisted, broken, disheveled, and overgrown. Crow had told him it was the same far to the south, where entire cities, not unlike those of the newcomers, had fallen into a similar state, the great forests of those places taking over as well. This was astonishing, Raven had wondered, especially now that he himself had ventured into the darker corners of the great city, flung out to the east of this strange place, if such would ever happen to the newcomers themselves. Since there was no use trying to continue to get into this great hall of totems and other precious objects, Raven made to leave. The big island's large city might well have another place very much like this, he thought, even though it was quite unexpected to see such a place here. It was clear enough that the actual people that were inside the transparent house were not villagers at all. The fact that the poles were not speaking to them, and in return the people were not listening and speaking in reply, told him that. For even though the great set of old poles were coming from very different places, from which in turn their makers might not speak to one another, or, at least before the newcomers appeared, had not often done so, still someone would be speaking and listening. It was a no-go. Lofting up over the new poles, artfully carved and looking very much like what the old poles did look like many generations ago, Raven made his way out over the water. He was not disconsolate, but he was disturbed. There is one more piece of this new puzzle I am still missing, he stated to himself. Perhaps I can figure it out if I could just get inside one of these odd places and speak to the poles and other objects myself, face to face. That must be the order of the day now. Find another great hall wherein the ancient work of his people's ancestors was sequestered, get in there, and have it out with them. The old poles might be mute, but he could find a way to reawaken them, maybe only for a few moments. It might be enough to get a clue. It was a matter of some hours before he sighted what must be the smaller city's equivalent place. No transparent walls this time, and no replica village with no one in it. But this time there was someone down there, a carver of all people. This was better. This made a little more sense, Raven thought, as he floated right down amongst the cedar shavings and wood chips. He croaked out a greeting, and the man promptly ran his adze into his hand. There was a spurt of blood, and Raven was now croaking with concern. A gasp from the man, but he did not cry out. Instead, he rushed over to a white box with a red cross on it and pulled out some bandages and liquids. With his hand now wrapped, he raised his eyebrows at Raven and said, rather sardonically, "Have I offended you, Great Spirit? Is my work not up to your exacting standards?" Raven was impressed that the artist addressed him directly, but he reckoned that if he replied, the man would likely not understand him. You never know, though. "Not at all, skilled sir. You honor me and my kind with your work, and I am grateful and delighted beyond measure that it should still be done." To this the man simply nodded, and Raven could not tell whether or not he had truly heard him, but somehow it didn't matter. The man flexed his hand and got straight back to work, once in a while looking up in the direction where Raven was perched. Raven, meanwhile, wanted to observe this man at his work for a time, so he hopped up onto a crossbeam that sheltered the carving area and peered back at him with his black, beady eyes. The man sighed and began to relax again. He was good. The pole was taking shape. It was Kakawin, the killer whale that the man was bringing out of the wood. The prominent dorsal fin, the sleek curves, and even the great teeth of the beast. Kakawin was a spirit unto itself, Raven knew, and didn't have the time to speak with just anyone. Indeed, it was sometimes the case that the more challenging the carving was regarding a spirit's likeness, the more challenging was the spirit itself. So here was one of his children who knew the ancient art and knew it well. He was, perhaps oddly, the spiritual mate of the woman he had recently met back in the caves. Their work was vastly different, but both were necessary, and more than this, necessary to one another. The newcomer's skills and those of his own people were at great length cut from the same cloth. These humans, why could they not see how they were related to one another? This was perhaps the greatest sadness for Raven and his friends. It was so obvious from their perspective because they were not themselves human. To lack such ability, to lack the perspective that seemed so elusive from within a single being, a single species, was in a way to lack everything. So it had been up to Raven and his comrades to provide it. Sometimes it worked, but sometimes it didn't. And now Raven realized that his entire journey thus far had been about finding out if any of it was still working, and upon whom. The carver worked on. It was wonderful to smell the fresh cedar and to see the forms of his friends, and even some of those who were not at all that friendly, come into being through the man's gifted hands. But at length Raven knew that this was not going to really get him anywhere. The new poles spoke fairly fluently, but they had no experience to share with him. It was as if they were part of a new generation, still in its infancy. They had no memory of what Raven needed to corroborate, but on the other hand, they had no tragedy in them either. So Raven flew around the large building he had been presuming was the Hall of Artifacts and settled down again near its main entrance. Many people were filing in and out, including a great many children. That just might be the ticket, he thought. Adults couldn't be tricked as easily as children, of course, though sometimes in this new world it was hard to tell which was which. Even so, Raven hopped over to a tiny one who was being wheeled around by what must be its mother. He distracted the adult with a hearty croak and flew near her head. The woman ducked instinctively and let out a yelp. He then discreetly dropped a large feather in behind where the little one was sitting, staring up in amazement at him. "Yes, tiny one, I am going to enter into you and see the world through your eyes for a while. Do not be frightened." Raven could tell that there was no fear inside the child's heart, and this was a very good sign, for its consciousness was about to be displaced, shoved aside for a while as Raven took its place. But this was only the first step. Raven had to find a secure spot where he could leave his own body behind. Scanning around, he noted that in front of the entrance to a much taller building there were several crates. He peered through the tiny cracks in their seams and croaked with astonishment. Inside were the still forms of animals. They were real and yet not real, living and yet dead. They must be the forms of those who had died and then been preserved, like the totems and other objects. Now Raven had his idea. He flew low over the crates and settled down on top of one of them. Then he prodded himself into unconsciousness and left his body right there. The people would think it was just another exhibit. Full of his purpose, Raven then forced himself to remember not to overdo it. There were a great many tales the people had told up and down the coast of his mishaps, tight spots he'd gotten himself into because he hadn't thought things through well enough. But Raven was older and wiser now than he had been back in the day. It had been a while since he'd found himself in a serious fix. Even so, he would have to be careful. Right now, his immobile but very realistic-looking body was not inside a crate. That would no doubt surprise the handlers, but there was a sporting chance that they didn't have any spare crates to stuff him into. If that were so, and why shouldn't it be, given that they were expecting a shipment of this sort and number of bodies and no other, then he could simply return his own spirit to his body when the door to the other building opened up, even a crack. In the meantime, he'd be able to find out what he needed to know about these odd places. Returning just in time to the little one, he grasped a hold of his feather and tickled the child's nose with it. When the child opened up its mouth and sneezed, Raven's spirit quickly traveled into it on subsequent inhalation. They were now going in, and he was already in. Ha! Raven's spirit chuckled, and the little one now giggled too. The mother was smiling, having recovered from her close encounter of the weird kind, but her child now had the gift of eternal insight and several other extraordinary powers as well. Better not make a big show of any of them, Raven now thought. "I don't think much of not being able to fly, though," he said to himself as they waited in a line-up to get inside the rest of the building. In the interim, Raven read the signage. There was a lot of it, all over the place. As soon as they had entered, ancient poles were present. He recognized a few of them, more dried moss and grass, barely discernible paint, for when they were new the poles had been brightly colored. Now they were all gray. What was it about the newcomer's penchant for that non-color? Everything must be gray. The pathways, the buildings, the precious objects of his people's ancestors, the color of the winter skies and the mists and fog of Thunderbird. Maybe it was the great bird's fault after all, Raven now thought, slightly pettishly. But for the moment the poles had not spoken. Well, of course they would not recognize him inside this little one. Raven hadn't thought of that at first. As he pondered a new trick, they were suddenly on the move, up a long, flowing metal belt, very smooth. It was almost like the feeling one got as one was lofted into the air on a warm updraft, wings spread wide and lazily. Once up to the next level, Raven beheld the first clues to the remainder of the present-day mystery. The objects that had been found and brought to this place were quite ancient. Raven struggled to recall when they had been originally fashioned, by whom and where. He couldn't remember every little thing for each of the myriad of objects. That alone told him this place was more than a storage site. It had something to do with teaching and memory. It was the newcomer's way of preserving thought itself. The description on the little signs beside each piece were incomplete, but they added to them other information which Raven didn't think was entirely relevant, like who had found the object, or who had donated it to the place, or catalog numbers and such like. But this was all for the newcomer's records and not for his people. The objects had been translated into something else. A stone bowl was no longer just a bowl, or if it had been a ceremonial bowl, it was now bereft of its ritual. Stone tools were placed in a manner that exalted their simple status. Ritual objects had become plain, and plain objects sacred. There was no way to really tell the difference anymore, as they were all lined up in cases together, and none of them could ever be properly used again. What was the point of all this? Raven found himself getting fatigued and frustrated, and the pedantic movement of the mother and her young charge was also wasting time. But to displace an adult's consciousness would have been too obvious, for every movement the person would have made, and indeed, the fact that the person would be prevented from speaking in any understandable fashion, might prompt his or her fellows to take them away and dispose of them somewhere. So it had to be an infant. No one would think twice if Raven uttered any incomprehensible exclamation through its mouth, and that was part of the ruse. But the downside was the pace and the inability of the little one to do anything on its own. The journey continued. At least they weren't skipping anything, and Raven was learning something new. But the more he saw, the more he felt at a loss. This series of halls into which the stuff of his people had been itself stuffed had no life in it. It was no different than the animal bodies he'd used for part of his trick. With a minor shock of self-recognition, Raven realized that he had left his lifeless body in order to break into the space of lifelessness itself. The little one gave a bit of a startled yelp at this, and the mother looked down with concern. But perhaps it wasn't all that serious after all. Raven could come back to life, and he wouldn't be new, like the being he was now borrowing. The exhibits were starting to pass Raven by, but here was something interesting. An entire interior of a longhouse, with small totems surrounding it, a dance screen, the bottom half of it original, the top half a recent addition, and cases upon cases of masks, including an entire case dedicated to himself. Raven peered with great intrigue and curiosity at these masks. You could tell not only the character of the people who had made this or that one, but also of the very artisan who had crafted it. Who fashioned this piece, rather than that, was also telling. Perhaps the artist had been a member of the Raven moiety, perhaps the Bear Clan, or some other. Perhaps he had been indentured to a powerful house, or yet been an apprentice shaman on his way into the shadows and the great forces of being. Moon shone out at him from the transparent case with her patent moony visage. Wolf, whom he had just recently met, and from whom had received a great gift, was also present in all her determination. Even a mask could speak of the being of the animal spirit represented. Of course, some were more powerful than others, but it was not so much their form or even their creator that gave them their power over time. No, it was how many dances and stories they had told, had appeared in, and the force of the actors who had portrayed them that lingered inside the form of the art. The true art of the mask was not in its style, but in its subsequent use. Raven found himself blinking back a few tears in any case. Some of the masks and other objects he remembered seeing in the sacred dances. Why were they now here, where no drums throbbed and no chants could be heard? The dance screen, behind which the players changed their appearance only to reappear and startle the audience with their cunning guises, was backed up into a wall with no room to maneuver behind. This too made no sense to Raven, but just then, as he was about to give up and find a way back into the other building where his body rested unmoving, he heard it. An ancient chant. The very one that one of the first men had heard in the sacred cave of the Transformers. He had been there, along with Kanakalak and others, and even danced himself. They had given this man, who was scared motionless by the Transformers' strange apparitions, a gift of the song so that he would not reveal their secret place to any other. And he did not. Even Raven had to concentrate now to find it again. It had been so long ago. But to his knowledge, no person had ever been there since this very early moment. Maybe that was part of the mystery. Maybe it was time to reveal this sacred place to the people, so they would know that the beings who had mentored them and had watched over them, and yet still cared, sometimes from a great distance, were still present if needed. The lost souls had wept at the very sight of him, for they had been certain he would never appear again. Yet the woman of the cave spoke to him with confidence, and the artist, just outside this building here, had almost shrugged him off. No, not quite, but he evidently was not at all surprised to see him. So from the people's viewpoint, he and the other Transformer beings were a possibility and not a certainty, as they used to be. But this was a start. Raven now realized that he was not starting entirely anew, and nor were his people. What these odd halls of old things were then at their best were teaching aids. In a pinch, the sacred objects held within could be duplicated for real use. After all, it wasn't the object itself that was important in the end, it was how it was used, and indeed, that it was used at all. This was the key thing. So Raven surmised that all of the things inside these buildings had been replaced by contemporary versions. It was the newcomers' idea that old things had more value than new things. Well, their culture was obsessed with the new, so that also seemed to make little sense as well. and not only old things from other alien cultures, to be collected and displayed almost as part of the booty of world conquest, but ancient things from their own people. Objects which their own distant ancestors had made and used were likewise preserved, when and if they could even be found, that was. The violence of the newcomer's history overtook all other histories. Raven shivered again at the thought of it. Yet, at some point, the ancient ancestors of the newcomers must have been very much like his own children. How they lived, how they thought even. Why could they not see this? Perhaps these places were a way in which to begin an acknowledgement of that human fact. The ancient chant had ended. After a pause, following the recital of his own name, it started up again, over and over. We didn't do that, Raven recalled. But it must be this way here, as the new people would wander by and hear it for the first time. A little contrived, but it couldn't be helped. Yet even hearing a song that he had not heard in ages had given Raven renewed vigor. It might be time to let this little one alone and find his own body again. To this end, he began the process of extricating himself. Just before he accomplished this, he heard a voice of an old man saying, "Ah, Raven, my old friend, perhaps it really is only you who knows the truth." Ha! Raven shook his spirit's head at that. The truth? The old man's voice was disembodied, and this confused Raven for an instant before he realized that it too was part of another exhibit. More masks, some very old, and some of characters rather obscure, like the murky Halibut, who Raven had met only once in his travels. Halibut was a friend of Cis-Util and hardly ever saw sun at all, and just as he was being pushed along out of the floor entirely, he saw two other characters that he had once helped, the two survivors of the flood. Of course, there had been more than two survivors, but this ancient memory called to Raven's mind an important analogy. The conquest and the Great Death were like the flood. There were survivors, but surviving meant having to live again rather than merely live onwards as before. This was what his people needed to do, and perhaps even he himself. Now the little one in which Raven had ensconced his own spirit was being trundled back out the door of the building and into the bright, airy plaza. This was the moment for Raven himself to depart. "Thank you, little one, for allowing me to accompany you. I wish you the best of lives," said he, as he now tickled the child's throat from within and was promptly coughed out into the air. He took hold of his feather, and the breeze wafted it up into the space above. Now, how to get into the other building? His feather floated down and scooted across the surface of the open space in the direction of the doorway. He would have to wait until it opened, clearly, but people were, from time to time, entering and exiting in turn. Closer and closer traveled the dark feather. At one point, a larger child gave it chase, but Raven quickly flipped it up into the air out of its reach. Then an opportunity finally presented itself. The door had been opened and held ajar. Two people were talking. Paying them no attention, Raven got his feather through the entryway and along the floor of the interior. Of course, the next challenge was to find out where they had placed his body. The feather wafted up and stuck itself to a place on the wall where the wind seemed to be going into a hole into the wall itself. This was not quite comfortable, but it was a handy place to view the changing scene, and it was not long before Raven was rewarded with the sight he desired. His body, frozen in fake death, had been placed on a desk where a young woman was working. That should be easy enough, thought Raven. He dropped his feather off the screened hole and onto the desk. He simply needed the woman to get the idea in her head to insert the feather back into one of his wings, preferably the one in which he had shaken it out of, but that was not absolutely crucial. She had something in her ears, and her eyes were glued to another object that was flashing images at her. Raven's spirit bounced the feather around enough that it eventually caught her eye. Assuming that it had simply fallen out of the stuffed bird, she picked it up, scrutinized the model, and attempted to reinsert it in an appropriate place. Good enough. Now Raven had to time his reanimation with the exit opening so as not to create too much of a disturbance. But as soon as he had regained his body, he heard a voice. "Don't leave us here, Raven. We know you have come for us, though you might not have realized it. We are high, high up in this very house. Take us with you as you leave." What? Who was speaking? It certainly wasn't the woman before him. She was a newcomer and could not speak in such a language. And this voice had as well used an antique dialect, one that Raven hadn't heard in quite a while. It could not be any living child of his then, but one of the ancient ancestors. Well, what was it doing in here? And more than one, in fact. Raven was duty-bound to investigate, of course, but his native curiosity would have propelled him in that direction in any case. It was true that so far his most recent investigations had produced little enough. Some insights, perhaps, but what was the actual point of all this? As he pondered his next move, the old man's voice from the exhibit came back to him once again. What was the truth, after all? Perhaps he did know it, but he had had to learn it, just like anyone else. And he had help in doing so, again, just like every other being which existed and had ever existed. That was the greatest error of the newcomers, Raven realized just then, the idea that their God was the truth and had no need of learning anything, so it was claimed. No such God could ever be of help to humans simply because he could not know how they had to live. Now Raven felt he was getting closer to the ultimate solution of this new puzzle of the present day. In spite of such grandiose claims, the newcomers had learned things, and indeed, they had also done so in spite of all those amongst them who had made similar claims about themselves. These claims had been especially leveled against his own people, as if they were the newcomers. Now these buildings with their transparent walls and boxes, with their wandering viewers and stacks of ancient objects, taught not only that others knew something, but that those who possessed the buildings and objects possessed them precisely because they represented knowledge that they didn't originally have. This was an improvement after all. It would be better still to have everything back into its proper place and use, and with this in mind, he decided to animate himself once again and follow the voice he had heard. It would be rather shamefacedly naked to do so, flying about inside a building and squawking at people to either get out of his way or to open doorways for him, but Raven didn't see any other way around it. Even with all of his clandestine trickery, Raven knew that sometimes the direct way was not only the best way, but the only way to get things done. At least the language of a bird in flight everyone could understand. There was nothing lost in translation when a creature of the air found itself trapped within a building. It wanted one thing. So Raven gave a croak of reanimated life, and the woman shrieked and fell out of her chair. In that moment, Raven was aloft and flying down the corridor. It called for some precision maneuvering, something more like Hummingbird could do with ease. Brushing against uncounted and untold edges, walls, door frames, and other things that Raven couldn't immediately identify, he flew round until he spied the entrance to a passage that went upwards. He settled down and squawked as obnoxiously as he could, calling attention to himself in the process. He then pecked at the transparent part of the door and cracked its material. Someone rushed out and opened it without asking why Raven needed to use the stairs of all things. Then he was up. The person had followed him. This was ideal, Raven thought. I only have to repeat my actions and this person will get it. This woman, even younger than the one he had startled, did seem to understand. Not the purpose of this ridiculous display, for Raven himself did not yet know why the voice was calling for him, and why it was even here in the first place, but more simply that Raven needed to go ever upwards. The voice was getting louder, encouraging him to come closer. Doors opened and new heights were attained. The young woman was puffing in her pursuit, and Raven knew the sooner this ended, the better. At some point he might not be able to get out of here with or without those who had exhorted him to take them with him. Finally, he had apparently attained the space in which the voices were cloistered. The woman pushed open one last door and received in return the astonished expressions of her colleagues who were working on piles of bird bones. Raven recognized this detritus as the same stuff that came out of 1,000 old subsistence sites. Sorting through all of that seemed to be a huge waste of time, but Raven didn't have any of his own to question these people's odd activities. He flew round, and then the voice arrested his attention once again. "In here! We are in here, Great Spirit! Open it up! Open it up!" Raven sat down and pecked at the boxes. The young woman who had been following him came in close and then, with a sudden lurch, tore open the lid of one of the boxes. Her face betrayed a sudden realization, but also a shock of recognition. Raven peered into the box, and what greeted his eyes also gave him a shock. A mummy! Leather flesh, brittle bones, green skull, elongated by the ritual of the princesses. The other people in this area had started to surround him. Then Raven felt a new consciousness with him. "Raven, there are more. About a dozen of us or so. We have been trapped here, trading box for box. Fly us away, and we will trouble you no more." Raven was really straining to concentrate now. What was the meaning of any of this? Box for box? Okay, these young people, highborn, must have been tree burials. They were all children then, if these remains were anything to judge by. The daughters of the highest crests, from here or there, and ancient, for such hierarchies had long fallen out of practice. The people's old precious metal, the newcomers called copper, had bound their heads, elongating them. If one was not in the know and simply had found one, it might have been taken as evidence of the much talked about alien presence on Earth. You don't say. Raven didn't need to be told about aliens presenting themselves. What had happened to his own people some time ago, but the same thing. He knew what they had meant, even so. The ritual of the princesses was risky, of course. These souls had perished from it, most likely. But the guardian had not been able to guide them to the spirit world because their boxes had lasted and lasted, only to be discovered by the newcomers and taken here before their spiritual contents had exercised themselves and moved on. That must have been their horrible fate. How long had they rusticated in this strange place? Raven allowed the young spirit to guide him now, pecking at each box in turn, and the young woman, the newcomer's version of the ancient princess perhaps, obediently opened each as he went. From the outside, no damage was being done. Nothing could be seen at all, but with each opening, Raven collected another trapped spirit. There had been 14 of them all told. The voice told him that no one else remained, and so Raven was ready to get out, and get out quickly. He deliberately flew into a transparent portion of the outer wall of the room, but made sure he didn't connect with its surface too vehemently. There was an expression of concern, and immediately the young woman had unlocked the wall and flung part of it open. Raven could feel the strident briskness of the upper air. It must be a fairly tall pillar he had found himself in. So much the better. In a trice he was out, regretting that he had not the time nor the ability to explain himself and his unexpected task to the wonderful young person who had unwittingly helped him accomplish it. But if little help happened in this world by chance, he reckoned that they would at some point meet again. Now he had some time to question the story of the girls inside of him. 2-1 they told it as he had figured. Nothing malicious, just misfortune. And indeed, this might well be the final piece of the puzzle Raven had been in search of. Not all of the conquest and the destruction of his people had been planned, or even celebrated after the fact. Much of it, to be sure, the worst of it, but there had been some parts thereof that had simply just happened, and even some of those that might have happened even if the newcomers had never shown up, nay, even if they had never existed. The great flood of ancient times, for instance, had been an act of the transformer's ancient self. Raven knew that he had done it to help his people, but even so, it had caused a great destruction as well. And what of the original migration itself? No one had forced his people's ancestors to come to what became their land. Did the newcomers feel forced? Crow had told them that those who came to the other side of the land, also with its own ocean, had felt that way. Not my problem, Raven responded, but he had also realized that inevitably it had become his problem. The world did tend to work like that over time, and now a similar thing was occurring. This time, though, it looked like it was the fault of the newcomers, but it could be adjusted, and Raven, after traveling to each of the far-flung sites from which the princesses had been taken, saying farewell and telling them to wait for Cayuman to catch up with them, knew that his final task would be to start the process of such an adjustment. It would be the most dangerous feat he had attempted since the beginning of it all, when he had traveled as far as anyone had ever traveled to bring light and fire to his people, newly freed from their clamshell vessel. But at least he would not be facing an enemy. No, the being itself was warm-hearted and caring. And then a final insight, coming out of all he had seen. Caring was not enough. If the being doing so was itself dangerous, even in spite of all its intentions and even its own history, such care must elicit carefulness in return. One had to be cautious about care, just as one could not accept the so-called care of the newcomers for so long. Raven realized that the manner in which he cared for his people worked because he himself often bumbled along just like they did, or had done so, not because of his good intents, not because of his tricks, but because of his insight. And his insight had come from his experience, just as did that of his people, and the help of his friends, themselves incomplete in their skills and knowledge. This too was like his children, the people of the coast. Once again, the new idea of what could be a spirit worth believing in had struck him. From that moment on, in spite of all that had occurred and was still occurring, Raven knew why he was still present. Epilogue. Raven returns the light. Raven had also then discovered the reasons the newcomers had invaded his land. They had come in search of the light. At some point, just before they came, they must have lost the source of light for their own kind and culture. They had then scoured the surface of the entire world, far from Raven's land, but also, eventually and inevitably, onto its very shores. So Raven had one final task to perform. He needed to return the light he had stolen ages past to an even higher place, one from which sun could warm and shine upon all the peoples of the world. He knew Sun was fully capable of doing so, but presumably had no clue about the current situation of the peoples. Sun was so bright that he could see nothing of that which he shone himself upon, and relied on his consort Moon to tell them how they were doing. But this communication, though it occurred each passing day, had to come round the entire circle of the world, and thus might well be partial. Sun would likely not know that he had been of late been loving the land so much that it was drying up. On top of this, not all people now had the light in their lives and in the places where they had lived. From Crow, Raven had gathered that many people were suffering due to its absence. Well then, it was high time to effect a remedy. The first challenge was to protect his own eyes. He would be blinded if he didn't exercise some caution. When he had stolen the light, of course, upon disgorging it, he had been burned black. Even his eyes had turned to the color of iridescent jet. But after a fashion he could still see, because it had only been for a moment that the sun was near him. This time, however, he would actually have to explain to Sun what he was doing and why it must be done, for Sun wouldn't let anyone get too near him for obvious reasons. Nor could he see who was coming to visit. Raven flew down to the intertidal rocks near one of the giant beaches on the western shore of the Big Island. He found what he was looking for right away, 2 medium-sized whale barnacles, their inner flesh intact. He used his beak to pry them off the rock and then attached them over his eyes. Their glue immediately fastened them to his skull. Perfect, thought Raven, except, of course, I can no longer see anything down here. No matter. I'll call for my friend Eagle to take me up to a certain height, and then Thunderbird himself will have to carry me even farther up. At some point, Raven knew he would have to go it alone, but the energy it was going to take to reach where Sun sat in the sky needed to be preserved for as long as possible. The entire flight undertaken alone might well end him for good. It took some minutes for Raven's special croak to echo down the coast and into Eagle's ears. When he heard it, he immediately turned round and flew back to where Raven sat on the rocky shoreline. That part was commonplace enough. But when Eagle heard of Raven's proposed plans, he whistled and stepped back. "Raven, old friend, I know you think you're right about this, but please consider just how risky it is. I can only take you up so far, and, if I may say so, even I had to squint to recognize you with those ridiculous barnacles attached to your face. Sun might have forgotten you after all this time. He could kill you, quite blindly. Eagle, you have always shown yourself to be my truest friend. Now I ask for this one final favor, this, and help me convince Thunderbird to take over in your stead. It will take all 3 of us to attain the altitude necessary for me to once again swallow Sun and carry him up just high enough that his light will reach all the peoples." Eagle paused to consider the implications of all of this. It was plausible, what Raven had just told him about why the newcomers had even come to this land. They were not expected there, nor had they ever been invited. At first, Eagle recalled with some clarity, Raven's children had not been aloof, and the newcomers could not have felt unwelcome. But it didn't last long. A giant canoe of the new people had been blown up, its remains carried by the tide southwards, Eagle remembered, as he had seen the burned-out hulk just below the water's surface, only to be cast up high on the drifting sands of one of the old coastal peoples, Chief Wickaninish's beaches. And this was just the first incident of many. It did seem like the newcomers were intent on finding the light they sought, at any expense to those who already had it. And so it had proved. So Raven's idea, whether utterly true or not, was still a good one. Sun must be raised up, so that no others would come in search of it. All would be able to see it, and thus feel its warmth from just where they were. Eagle finally relented. "Raven, even if this is crazy, I will do it for you, and perhaps for the people as well." Raven thanked him with a hearty croak and then settled himself down on Eagle's broad back. The added weight slowed Eagle up, but not by much. Raven marveled at his friend's strength and skill in the air. Up and up they went together. Raven had never flown this high on his own, and yet they were still a long way from where Sun continued to brilliantly sit, hanging away up there, seeming no larger than when Raven had viewed him from the rocks now far below. But Eagle was always as good as his word. He labored ever in his ascent, and when he had reached his limit, he scanned round for Thunderbird to take over. Raven had an even better idea. "Let's get in front of Sun, Eagle, and make Thunderbird think there is a storm coming. Since he didn't start it, he will certainly show up to see who did." Eagle immediately concurred, knowing that this kind of thing would be guaranteed to incite the great bird's wrath. Thunderbird brooked no competition of any kind, hence his perennial feud with the sea monster. Together, with both their sets of wings outstretched to the limit, they succeeded in covering up a goodly portion of Sun's rays. It didn't take long to hear a low rumble out of the north, and after a few moments more, Thunderbird was bearing down on them, making their combined size shrink into insignificance by comparison. The great bird's wings were about to clap in time-honored fashion when he saw his 2 distant cousins, one on top of the other. Instead of anger, they heard laughter. "What is this I see? 2 born friends carrying on like this. You 2 must have time on your hands to be engaged in such reckless nonsense. Isn't there something better you could be doing than tricking me all the way down here, out of season, and distracting me from my other rounds? What is the meaning of it?" Raven cleared his throat and explained his mission. Thunderbird stared stonily at him. Eagle then put in his support. "After all, great bird of the stormy skies, I have already done my bit, and it was no mean feat, I can assure you, to reach your heights." "That's all very well, but now you want me to take over? It's not the weight, of course. Raven, you old joker, you weigh nothing to me. But have you thought about what Sun would do to my feathers, which must be slick at all times to repel all that salt water from the ignominious sea monster's spit?" Neither Raven nor Eagle had thought of this, but they couldn't very well let on. "You can skim the oil from my feathers, dear comrade. That will at least get you back to the northern place where the Ulicans still swim," Raven suggested. And what will you do? Your own flight will be hampered if your feathers dry out. Yes, but Sissy Oodle doesn't deign to spit on me. I'll get by, and when you are done polishing your ample plumage, you can dump a few drops of oolican oil on top of me upon your return trip. Oh, I always thought you were crazy, Raven, with your bizarre fancies and tired parlor tricks. But since Eagle here thinks you are of a noble heart and perhaps even sound mind as well, I will do it. I have enjoyed these 4 months away from fighting, I must admit, and it wouldn't have happened without your negotiations. He should talk, Raven thought. Parlor tricks, my word. But this was not the time to upbraid the giant bird for living to create both noise and nuisance. Eagle was getting tired, and Raven knew it was now time to exchange rides. Good luck, my old friend. I sincerely hope I will see you again, was Eagle's farewell as he careened downwards. Soon out of sight, too, for Thunderbird had gotten underway in the opposite direction. I have never flown this high before. I am proud I can do it, was his oversized comrade's first comment. Good for you, Raven thought. Like Kanakallak, Thunderbird was sometimes too much. Walk softly was Raven's motto, though he had learned that the hard way over the ages. But now Thunderbird was going to prove his worth as never before. Sun would certainly be able to see him approach, but Raven himself would be invisible. You will have to call attention to the fact that I am visiting Sun and not yourself, he declared. I have a better idea, clever one. You can leap out of my feathers and eat him before he even knows what's going on. Raven shook his beak, even though Thunderbird couldn't see him. No, my comrade in danger, that won't do. 1, I have to fly upwards on the final leg myself, otherwise your feathers will be too dry to rehabilitate. And 2, Sun must know of the reason I am to carry him further upwards. It is the only right way to do such a thing to him. Because he doesn't trust you. Precisely. That was it, after all. Well, he had stolen Sun from his previous place, and even though Sun had acclimatized, so to speak, over the generations, and had started to love more and more the land he shone upon, it had put a distance between him and his lover, Moon, that was only remedied now rarely, when there was an eclipse. Raven did feel some bad conscience about this. Thunderbird wasn't stupid. He knew the score. So upward they went, until the point was reached that the giant bird hovered. This was the moment of departure. Okay, Raven, we're close, but I am drying out rapidly and should return. I thank you for the opportunity to gain new heights, and if we do not meet again, I will remember you. Thanks a lot, Raven thought with chagrin. Like I'm going to surely die in this venture, is that it? But Raven merely thanked the great bird in return and set off. It was hotter than he had ever known it, and brighter, but the barnacle lenses now evidenced just what a brilliant idea that had been, for Raven could see clearly through them, in fact, better than he had ever seen before. It was not long before he was on his final approach. Sun had not yet spied him. He would have to call to him, and that presented a difficult moment. Sun, I hail you from the earth below, and would approach to speak with you on the most urgent of matters. Raven croaked as loudly and as boldly as he could. An even hotter wind blasted Raven's feathers and beak, for Sun was now speaking in return. Is that you, trickster? It has been a very long time. If you want to know, I still miss my moon. Raven didn't need to know that. He could guess that it was so. But they had to get beyond this, and soon. He explained his theory. And so I need to take you even farther up, so that your light can shine on everything and everyone. This is a reasonable idea, Sun contemplated aloud. I will at least be able to see Moon better, from a higher vantage point. And she has told me that some people have complained that I am warming their lands overmuch of late. Of course, I didn't know of this. No, you wouldn't, but Raven resisted any attempt to mock Sun. After all, he was the source of all life, and even Raven had discovered life as it already was, and then made it into something quite different. But it was the Sun that had started it all off. Then breathe yourself into the smallest ball of fire you can, my ancient acquaintance, and I will swallow you one more time. What are those things? Barnacles? Was Sun's final reply before he shrunk himself down. Raven could only speculate at what the people must be thinking at this moment far below them, but in trying to avert another disaster, it might well appear that one had already struck. Raven moistened his tongue as best as he could. The long flight and the bright light had parched him as well. It was going to be a supreme effort to accomplish this task. He swallowed hard, and then did so once again. His giant beak opened, the stuff of legends, and just like that, Sun had rolled himself down his tongue and into his throat. The burning was incredible, and Raven winced, but he kept his beak open so most of the heat would escape, and used the hot updraft to continue his now once again blind ascent. Without Sun out in the open sky, Raven could see nothing through his novel lenses. How high did Sun need to go? This might work, he heard a gurgle from his own throat. No doubt Sun was thinking of a vantage point where he could view Moon more hours of the day. Well then, Raven knew he couldn't carry on like this much longer in any case, so he coughed, and Sun was disgorged back into the sky. Raven had to turn away from his heat. His throat was so burned he could not speak. but Sun confirmed his own guess. "Yes, I can see her. This is much better. I thank you, Raven. This goes some way in telling against your original trick, about which I was unhappy." To this Raven could only gently nod, bidding his silent farewell. Every movement hurt. It was a very good thing that descent took so little work, but the farther he got from Sun, the cooler the breeze was, and by the time he was halfway back to the ground, Raven could breathe normally once again. His feathers had cooled off, and his beak could open and close as usual. He was increasingly impoverished of eyesight, though, and he would have to wait until he could clamber back on some sharp rocks to tear the barnacles off his head. He soon got his wish. Sort of. The impact flattened him out for a moment and cracked one of the barnacles right off, leaving a white ring around his eye. The other one hung there limply. Raven brushed it off with his wing, but for a while he just sat there, unable to move further. "Another 2 talons broken," he lamented, "and about a dozen feathers lost. But he could breathe, see, and swallow. Could he then speak? If you can hear me, O people of the coast, I have cared for you and care again. But now I must adjoin my care to all, and in so doing I have returned the light to a place anew, from which it shines forth more widely. But I will always be with you, though my light may seem further from us than ever before. Know that I will seek with you as well the inner light, and will do so always." With this soliloquy, Raven hopped into the shade of a giant hemlock and promptly fell asleep. And in his dream time, the people and spirits were one thing. They were many, and in this lay their strength. Their very multitude carried them forward, their very diversity gave them perspective, and their experience of overcoming told them that they now once again had a future. Thank you very much for listening.